Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Welcome to a special bonus episode of Podyssey. To say that this podcast has become a full-time job in the last few months would be to do it a disservice. It would both understate the joy I get from it and the obsession it demands. There is no rota to this, and there are no days off. Once I cram my head full of as much as I can on a topic, it is one of those block games where I either slide everything to make space and slot it into place, or I remain lost in the maze. And so, quite simply, there is no way of doing this a little bit. I need to either do it or not. As you may have seen, I am now in the process of planning and fundraising for Season 2 of Podyssey. 20 gleaming white marble episodes tackling topics from Athenian democracy to golden apples and myths from Pandora to Theseus. Only you can make it happen. You are the commissioning editors. By the time the last 5 episodes of Season 1 have aired, I hope you will have ordered a second one. So pledge your monthly support from as little as $5 on Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/Podyssey to make it happen. In this bonus episode, I explore notions of archaeology with a, by now, familiar guest. We talk about what archaeology used to be and what it is now, also what it isn't. Its connection to the mythology this program explores, the excitement of discovery, and the drudgery of everyday record-keeping, the extent to which it is a practical, physical, even profession, the way it straddles both science and creativity, and its unbreakable relationship to the context of not just time, but also place. I hope you enjoy it. So I would like to welcome to Podyssey, in the flesh for once, not by remote, the archaeologist that you've heard from many times, Alexandra Angeletaki-Røe, whom I can now exclusively reveal is also my big sister. Hello, Alexandra. Welcome.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me.
I guess we have to go right to the very beginning. What is the first myth that you remember as a kid?
Well, as you know, my godmother and godfather were both archaeologists, and already very early, when they would come with gifts, they would come with books. And the first book was about mythology, ancient Greek mythology. And I remember very vividly that I was very inspired by the story of Ulysses, Odysseus, who managed to escape Polyphemus, the giant.
Oh, yeah, the giant with the one eye.
The giant with the one eye,
yeah.
The Cyclops. And I made the whole story in my mind. I created, recreated in a way the story. It was something that I thought was amazing, that a man of that size would be able to be so cunning to save himself and his companions by hiding under the ship and going out.
We will talk about him when we come to do the Odyssey, maybe Series 6. Yes, and I remember the drawings. There were very nice drawings with each story, and there was one of him in his home, and the people were really tiny compared to him, and they were hiding. You could see them on the shelves hiding behind blocks of cheese and vases and under the sheep and the goats, which is how they went out. My first memory is from the same book, but the story of Daedalus and Icarus, who made wings of feathers and wax. And Icarus flew too close to the sun and it melted, and so he fell to his death in the Aegean Sea. And I remember that drawing very well, Daedalus trying to reach for him, to grab his leg, but he was already too far. So when did that change into, I guess, a more professional aspiration to make this love of the old stories of ancient Greece your profession, archaeology? When did that happen?
I think that happened very early because our mother, as you know, was working at the museum, and they became very good friends with both Nikos Zafiropoulos and Fotini Zafiropoulou, that were successive efforts of antiquities in the Cyclades, which means director of
the head of antiquities in that region.
And I was sent to find them in Delphi when I was 10 years old to spend a month with them. They didn't have children. And I was 10 years old, and I remember the whole trip.
It's an amazing show of trust, thinking back.
Yeah, of course.
From Mum, who was very protective, to trust them to take you 10 years old for a whole month, right?
Yeah, of course it was. There was a lot of trust between them. So I remember the moment I reached Livadia, which is a town close by Delphi, and she came to pick me up, my godmother, Fotini. She came to pick me up, and we were sitting in the taxi, and she was showing me Parnassos that was coming up and telling me about the god of light and the muses that lived up there, Apollo, and how he could be ferocious if people would not do as he wished, and how the whole area was dedicated to him. So we arrived there, and we lived by the museum that was already there, and a lot of the reconstructed monuments of Delphi were standing already, because it was a pretty early excavation. And the house was right next to the museum, and I would enter from the back door of the archaeological site, and I just had bought a camera, big one, and I would go through.
I remember it. Yeah,
and I would take pictures, of the monuments. But the most amazing thing we did was that at night we would take a tape recorder and go up at the theater of Delphi that has this panoramic view over the valley of Delphi. And sit at night under the moon and listen to classical music. I mean,
wow.
A child of 10 years old. And then, of course,
that must have been amazing.
It was amazing. And I would play in the garden, playing the Pythia. I would be the Pythia.
Oh, so you would be the oracle of
the
Delphi.
Oracle of
Pythia was the oracle of Delphi.
Yeah. So,
and you would give your predictions for the future.
But
that must have been so much fun.
It was
and
so fun.
I have a vague memory of seeing the photos you took, because you had them in a little album, I think, a special one from that trip. And I seem to remember, which is interesting considering our conversations now, that you were taking photographs not only of the big monuments, but you were taking photographs of little things and also plants and flowers and little lizards and things like that. So you were interested in the environment around the antiquities, not just the big temple or whatever.
Yeah, because as a child, they have a totally different view of things. Everything is interesting. And especially that was like my first trip away from my parents. And I was allowed to carry a camera and go discover the world, of archaeology. But then I followed her to a trip on the mountain Iti, where there was a sanctuary of Hercules. And that was the place that, according to mythology, he was burned because the Anira, the jealous wife, gave him a garment
to wear that was poisoned, and made him crazy.
And he had to ask his fellows to burn him. And later they created a sanctuary there. And then we went further down on a cemetery that was called Kallio. And then she explained to me how the cemetery, by, showing me exactly on the remains of the graves, which part was Hellenistic, that means 3rd century BC, and which part was Roman, that they have been...
From the layers,
from the building itself.
Yeah.
And I asked her, how do you know that this part is earlier and this part is later? And she told me, because Romans had plaster. Greeks did not use plaster to join the stones together.
Right.
And that just made a click in my mind. I thought, wow, if you know that, then you're an archaeologist.
Yeah.
So that's right there. I decided I will become an archaeologist.
And that's interesting, because I think one of the aspects of archaeology that people maybe don't quite understand is how practical a science it is.
Yes, it is.
Tell me a little bit about that. Like, how is it different to being a historian, let's say?
Yeah, it's very different to being a historian, in the sense that you do have the part where you refer to scripts or ancient sources and you go looking let's say that if someone referred to the temple of Poseidon in Sunion, then I would try to find the area to see whether there's something. You can,
so you can start from text.
You can start
and
from
go
text
looking for
and
something.
Go looking. And that's what,
or you can start from something you find and go looking for the text to identify it.
It
can
goes
do
both ways. Yeah. It goes both ways. But it's not enough with that, because then you have the practical part of archaeology. To give you an example, what I have learned doing excavation and touching the ceramic bits that we call ostrakon, which is just a bit of ceramic that you find, I can see the
fragment
difference.
Of pottery.
The fragments of pottery. I can see the difference in the color of the clay, in the weight that the piece of the clay has on my hand, in the quality itself.
So how smooth it is, how rough it is. Yeah.
And that's not something that you can actually refer to if the other person has not felt it.
You cannot learn it from a book.
No, you cannot. And at the same time, if you're going to do excavations, for example, you have
I have to say, that is kind of your party trick. Yeah. Right? So whenever we all go for a walk as a family, you will see something on the ground and you will say, that's an ancient one. And to us, we cannot understand how it is different to the other broken things that are around it. But to you, it is completely different. But it is a practical knowledge.
It is. Yeah. And that I've been doing as a child. With my godmother, walking around Rhenia and Delos. I remember myself swimming and then sitting on the rock to get dry. And I would put my hands in the ground and I would pick up a piece of pottery and I would go to her and I would tell her, what's that? And she would say, oh, that's a part of a cup and it's probably Hellenistic from 3rd century BC or 2nd century BC. She knew how to date it and that was amazing for me. And that's how I learned. And that is something, I mean, you can learn the theoretical part of archaeology, but you have to have the practice. That's why in most of the archaeological studies, archaeologists have to go with the teachers to the field. Yeah. To understand how things look, how things feel.
It's like completing your medical degree by working in a hospital.
Exactly.
It's a tactile and practical study.
It is.
The other thing that is becoming more and more important, I think, and we will talk about that, how archaeology has shifted over the last few decades, is the topology also of the place. Another reason why it's important to be there, not to be reading about it in book or being taught about it. So when you look at a landscape, how do you distinguish?
First, you have to know the landscape from before. And then you can find natural things and you can find man-made things. So if you look on a landscape that has like smooth lines on, let's say, low hills, and you see that this hill is very smooth on the sides and at the top of it is flat, then you know there's something there.
Right.
It's accumulated soil. It's not a natural formation. So that gives you an idea that there has been activity.
So you become good at guessing the shape of what is underneath, basically.
Yes.
And whether the shape of something underneath is natural or whether it has a roof, for example, right?
Or man-made.
Yeah.
Like, for example, let me tell you, like, we have these dry stone walls in the Cyclades.
Yeah.
Okay. Which go parallel. Yeah. Parallel to each other and transversal. But suddenly, in between these rectangular pieces, you find a round one. Why? Something else is there. Something that was man-made. The people that live there and work there and maybe, the farmers or whatever would have to follow the shape of that particular area.
Oh, I see.
So they cannot go against.
I see. So it's an outline of a ghost of what used to be there, basically.
Yes, and you refer to these hikes that we do and the pieces of pottery that we find. So when I go on a hike, I actually have trained friends to look for the signs. So if you are on the top of a mountain, let's say in Mykonos, for example, and you can see all over the place, you can actually see from the sea what's coming. So it's called Vigla, that you have the overview.
Yeah.
And then you find water. Somewhere you see that there's a well, so there is water. And then you find pieces of pottery. Then it's the pottery itself that tells you that it was a place where people would have done something. Would have lived there.
Because it has practical advantages.
If you wouldn't have water, you wouldn't find it.
Yeah, so you have to kind of get into the mode of thinking of the people back then to say, where would I look for
Yes.
shelter? Where
Yes,
would
exactly.
where would protection
And
be?
read the landscape you have around you as well.
The most important shift, really, of archaeology in the last few decades, it's gone from a study of
Artifacts.
objects,
Yeah.
artistic objects, I
Yeah.
should say,
Yeah.
to a study of how people used to live. Not that that didn't happen before,
No.
but the focus was very much on high value discoveries, wasn't it?
Well,
Like who will find a big statue?
Well, that
Or a
was
gold.
part.
Anytime anyone found anything,
Exactly.
gold jewelry was like a big deal.
That's why, if I may say, all of these antiquities are found today in all the private museums around the world.
Yeah.
Because back in the 1800s, in the 1900s, you had these aristocrats that would go hunting. And they would go hunting, not because they knew how to excavate a site and how to keep a diary and how to be able to document whatever they found, but to find something to take back to sell to the museums or to some aristocrats and create a fuss about that.
Yeah.
And that could not be done with a piece of pottery, a broken piece of pottery. That would not interest anybody. You would have to find a statue. That's how history went. I mean, archaeology in the beginning was this kind of hunting after remains from antiquity that could be sold, actually. And of course, you had also the genuine interest of people reading Homer and trying to find, back to the roots of the European thought, as they say. But archaeology as a discipline has evolved a lot.
Which I'm finding out now from Debbie, also came in cycles and usually went with periods when people were more skeptical about religion. So whenever you have a period where people are a bit more skeptical about religion, they go back to ancient thought as a source of inspiration. And how it would have been amazing for, 16th century Elizabethans to have access to texts that weren't edited by the church. Because before that, all you had were the approved texts by the church. So the first time the full things became available for study, there was an explosion of interest. And people started traveling to the Mediterranean, and it became a thing to hunt for these artifacts.
Yeah, the expeditions to Moret and all these, the French aristocrats that came down. Of course, on the other side, because they had with them people that were drawing, for example, and they kept diaries, we have a lot of information that it's lost. For example, Nineveh. Nineveh is a case where we have nothing after the war. And we have an English lord. He went looking for the remains of Nineveh, and he had with him painters that did amazing paintings, and we have his book.
So at least we have some record of it.
So we have at least some records.
The physical thing has disappeared.
Yeah, so that was really important.
Were there some people that were better at being more respectful? People like Schliemann, for instance, because
Schliemann
I know
is a very debated figure. Let's not go into that because that's a very long discussion.
But the short version of it is that
version is some of them had knowledge and accumulated knowledge because they worked on the site and they used the local people to find out where things were done.
Right.
But some of them did not have the technique, let's say, to gather as much information as we would gather today.
And did some damage. Yeah.
Like I can refer to one thing that's pretty known. It's the seals that were found in Delos. 14,000 pieces of burnt
I helped Mum catalogue them. I know those seals very well. They were my job for one whole summer.
Yes, but the problem is that the archaeologists that excavated this area threw them away.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for the Greek archaeologist that happens to be my teacher, Nikos Tambolidis, who is now the director of the Acropolis Museum, who was just taking an afternoon stroll by the excavation and found them, they would never be discovered.
Right. So because they were small and plentiful,
and because
it was assumed that they didn't have value. They weren't unique enough.
And because that particular person was not looking for that, who was looking for huge sculpture pieces or architecture pieces or whatever.
And if I remember well from cataloguing them, from helping Mum catalogue them, because each family they were usually in 4 quadrants.
Not all of them.
Some of them could be in 3. But they were like heraldry, basically. So they had certain symbols that denoted a particular family or a geographical region.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say we make an agreement and we say that, you take over my house and we put our seals on the clay, and that is, you put your own and I put your own, and that's the contract around the papyrus. Yeah.
And what the symbols of my family were had a meaning.
Yeah.
And what the symbols of your family were had a meaning. And actually decoding those meanings, we were able to find a lot about which gods were represented by which plant, by, all these symbolic things.
But also
and the connections,
geographical connections, because some of the symbols...
And trade.
Some of the symbols can be recognized from other artifacts, let's say.
So why was it that archaeology moved on from, I guess, I don't want to say from the remarkable to the unremarkable, but why did it move from the unique to the useful?
I would say moved from the romantic to the scientific.
Right.
That's what I would say.
Right.
Llévate más de lo que esperas todos los días con el nuevo Mid Value en McDonald's. Ahora puedes comprar uno y sumarle otro por $1. Así que cuando tu equipo favorito enfrente a sus rivales, enfrenta tus antojos con $5 Meal Deals. Y si estás corriendo para alcanzar el desayuno, corre al app para llevarte ofertas antes del cut-off. Tú decides, y con McValue, tu decisión siempre rinde más. Precios y participación pueden variar. BOGO $1 válido para un producto de igual o menor valor. Debe estar registrado en Rewards para ofertas en el app.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
As you see, archaeology became a discipline in the 1900s. And gradually, a lot of methods were developed to be able to document. The documentation is the most important. So you have to be able to reconstruct all the layers. That's called stromatography. And you have to be able to go back in every little detail in order to put together all the results that you have after a big excavation. And the results could be from small, let's say, seeds from what they were eating or nuts, up to huge statues or a whole building. So let's say that archaeology has to work in a very multi-level way.
And multidisciplinary. To be able to reconstruct what you have done during a deconstruction. Ultimately, what you arrive at is an interpretation of your findings.
That's what you do.
So the more educated your guess is, the more accurate it is.
Yes,
basically.
You have to put all the elements that you have collected, and you cannot be sure that you can actually see what relates the one element to the other when you're actually doing the excavation. So you have to really record in such a way that it can give you the full picture afterwards.
Right. And also because you don't know what is important and what is not beforehand.
Exactly.
Because I remember you telling me about examples where, for instance, you can tell the use of a building by the fact that there were lots of layers of remnants of food on the floor and things like that. So you knew it was a tavern, where people would eat. And
that's the big difference, because let's take Delos as an example that we know a lot of it, because Delos is very important as an archaeological site. It has a very long history, starting in 3000 BC and ending in the 2nd century after Christ. And you have the sanctuary, you have all of that you have in many other places in Greece, but you also have a city. And you have the activities and whatever is connected to a trade port. You have the tavernas where people would go and drink and eat nuts and mezze, small plates. And you have the houses where people were living, the first floor, the second floor, the toilet, their atrium, the market, the way they would grill their food, all of that. You have all of these. So we do not have, there are like fragments of cities here and there around the Mediterranean, but we do not have such a complete picture. So if you excavate a house and you throw away the bottom of the dining room without going through it with water to collect the seeds, you will never find out what the food they were eating was, because these are very tiny things. And that has been done in later times.
Yeah. And I remember another example that you told me that from the remains, the organic remains that you find, you can often tell what temple a particular temple was, because the sacrifices were different for different deities. So if you find a lot of piglet bones, it usually indicates that it was a Demeter temple, for because example, that was her favorite sacrifice.
Or
and you
can recognize a ritual that is described in some texts. And like we did with the French Archaeological School, I participated in an excavation in Delos where we find on the altar of the Isis temple, we find bones of birds.
Right.
So then you go backwards, then you find the bones of birds, and then you start looking, what do the texts say about this kind of rituals?
Yeah. I remember, I think I went to a temple of Poseidon with you, and they had dug, one of those cross sections, because they were testing still to see if there was something on the site.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a layer of lots and lots of seashells.
That was in Mykonos.
And you were like, the moment you saw that, you were like, this was a Poseidon worship site, because those were the offerings.
Because right there you have a difference between knowing what the ritual is and knowing what people ate. Because if these shells that were in a thick layer in the soil were broken, then they were eaten.
Right.
If they were not broken, then there was a difference.
Yeah.
That's the tactile experience.
And the other thing that has made a big difference is technology advancing.
Yeah.
And archaeology has always been a very friendly discipline to technology.
Depending on technology. Because, even in the first steps of archaeology, if you wouldn't have a geodetic station, you would know where the level of your excavation started. You have to have a 0 point and know where it is. If you don't have the 0 point, then you're lost.
Yeah.
Because it's not the same level.
You're missing the third dimension, basically.
You're missing the third. Now we have 3D reconstructions of through photography as well and drawing. You create the 3D dimensions of the excavation. Back then, we would have, after you finish let's say the cross-section, you have one cross-section which geometrically has to be on the right spot.
Yeah.
You have to have the 0 point, and then you start going down. Yeah. And then every day, after the workers finish digging, you have to document. You have to take pictures. You have to do drawings. You have to keep a diary with every little detail. You have to put numbers so that you know how many things you found that day and where you're going to keep them, so that you can go back and study them.
That is the definition of multidisciplinary.
It is.
Also, it means that you even have new branches of archaeology popping up all the time.
I was reading forensic archaeology, photogrammic archaeology. Photogrammetry is something that we use a lot. Or you can, you take samples from the ceramics to find out what type of ceramic it is, or the marble, to know where it comes from. So, of course, it's very important with collaboration with technology. You couldn't do all that.
I was reading an article recently that there is now a new discipline, for example, where people are specializing in recognizing potential sites from high-definition satellite photography. Where you can see kind of the whole terrain.
Yeah, of course.
And in the same way you were talking about the topography of being there, there's now an expertise in looking at it from above and saying, this looks suspiciously round to be natural.
But it takes time. Like, there is a new find of a labyrinth type of building right now in Greece. It was just published by some newspapers, and everybody in Crete, and everybody's going, oh wow, that's the labyrinth of Minotaur and all of that. But it's going to take at least 3 years for us to be able to put the things together and decide what that was.
And even then, you don't know whether in the next 10 years you will find that labyrinths were a very common feature for rich people to have in their villas.
Exactly.
And you find another 5.
But the thing is, like when I went to an expedition again with the Norwegian Archaeological School this time in the 90s in Tegea, around Tegea.
Tell me, where is Tegea for listeners?
Tegea is in the heart of Peloponnese, and we went surveying the landscape. So what we were doing as students back then, it was walking through a field and counting how many pottery pieces we saw on the surface. And then some botanologists would go and take samples around the earth that we had around. And then geologists would go and look at the stones around and decide what happened, because climate change is also very much a part of archaeology.
Yeah.
You cannot have archaeology without climate.
So you can have botanologists, biologists,
Everything.
Your journey into archaeology, in a strange way, although it felt like punishment at the time, because you first of all studied to be a tour guide of archaeological sites before going to university, so you could support yourself or whatever. Actually, it meant you were slightly ahead of the game.
Yes.
Because while archaeology was still primarily preoccupied with beautiful objects, the art of guiding people through a site like Delos is telling them the human stories of the people that lived there. And that is really closer to what archaeology has become today.
Yeah, not only that, but because I went to the guide school, which is a national school of 2 years, and we travel all over Greece, I saw everything. So we would be trained by our teachers who were fantastic back then. Nikos Tambolidis, Yorgos Margaritis. These were people that had just finished their PhDs and coming back with new ideas from the different, one from Germany, the other one from France, with human-centered way of thinking about history. And we would go and visit all these museums. And at the end of these 2 years, I could open the door of a museum, have a look, have never been there before, and I knew what I was going to say. And that's really amazing.
When really, if you had got straight into archaeology school, you would probably learn some general stuff, go to some sites, but then specialize in a particular. But by doing the guide school thing, really you saw all of
it. And that actually happened because when I started participating in one of the excavations that I've done together with my godmother over a long period of time, I was sitting with the archaeology students to do the work after the excavation and, categorize things and put them in the museum boxes and everything. And they would look at it and they wouldn't be able to recognize what it is. And I would tell them, well, this is archaic, this is classical, this is Attic. It was
practical
part of my
experience.
life.
Yeah. You jokingly refer to archaeology sometimes as the study of garbage.
Well, it is, actually.
Were people always interested in what had come before them? Or is it a new, who was the first archaeologist, really? Who was the first person documented that went around doing this thing? Are we talking 1900s or are we talking before that?
I mean, even in ancient times, they would refer to whatever stories were connected to the place they were living or the place they would visited. I mean, if you read Herodotus, you see how he refers to all the Egypt or Ethiopia or whatever. And then we have this known guide of ancient times, the 2nd century AD, Pausanias, who traveled all over Greece, and he collected narratives from people who knew stories about their places, but he also went looking for them. So he would visit the place and he wrote down what exactly he saw. I went to Delphi and there was this and this and this and that. I went to Sunion and there was one column standing. I went there. I went to Acropolis. The only problem was that you would get seasick. so you couldn't go to the island. So we only have about the main.
Confined to mainland Greece.
But there was always interest in what came before.
Were they doing what we do now, trying to guess what these things might have meant to the civilization that came before?
Of course. Or they created mythology.
So what's the link between archaeology and mythology? Because listeners will not know this. It's a little bit of a behind the scenes, I guess. But often I will come to you and I will say, can we say this? And you will say to me, no, you cannot say this. You can say this, or you can say that there are some who believe, or there's a theory about that. So it's a constantly evolving and very uncertain discipline, isn't it?
And it changes from time to time. We have a lot of different theoretical, directions of how you explain things that you find. But what is important is to be aware that all of that is interpretation. I mean, we delve into what we find, but we don't have, except some of the sources, the written sources from here and there, we have to recreate the time and the space and the way people were thinking by interpretation.
Yeah.
So that makes it difficult.
And that means that the personal prism through which you interpret is vital. It can change everything.
It is. And of course, you can take a stand. You can be a Marxist. You can be a post-processual archaeologist. You can be a cultural archaeologist. You can
feminist,
be,
of course.
Feminist, whatever.
It has made a big difference.
And you decide your theoretical, let's say, background. But of course, there are some things like, let's say, if you find a cup that people used to drink wine with, it was a cup for drinking wine. There are some facts, let's say, that you cannot deviate from. But then the interpretation is about the environment and the human way of thinking around what they were actually doing and how they lived. So that we can never accept classical Athens, that we have a lot of written sources, not all of the different periods, and especially prehistory, it's not covered the same way.
We can never be completely sure.
No, we can never.
But we can draw inferences, and they can be educated or not. And that means that it is important that archaeology as a science for a long time, after becoming established as a proper discipline, was dominated by rich white men, really. So the interpretation part of it is all that of straight rich white men.
That's what we call colonialism, having this idea that you coming from a white Western background would know better. But like Machu Picchu was discovered by an American archaeologist, but he would never discover it if the Indians of the area would not have shown him where Machu Picchu was, you know.
Right.
And the Acrotiri in Santorini, nobody would have found it if the guy that had a goat herd did not notice that he would lose his goats through a hole. Of course. No, that's true.
So he went to the authorities and he said, I keep losing goats.
Yeah, and that's another thing, because we underestimate a lot of times people that live in an environment.
Yes.
And you don't have to be an archaeologist to see that there is a difference, you know, here and there. And that there might be something hidden. And illicit antiquities, it's a big, big thing. Like these Cycladic idols.
And has been for a very long time. You were telling me that you get curiosity cabinets really from the 1600s, where people would collect things and display them for
even
their guests.
The Romans. They plundered many places in Greece. They took
of
away
course,
whatever they could
for
find.
their villas.
For the villas, and would invite people to show them.
So maybe that is a way where there is both a connection with the past, but also where maybe the hobbyists of the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, had a slight advantage because they weren't experts. They had to rely on locals.
Yes, exactly.
To show them where maybe the sites will be. And so there's a strange gap. When archaeology becomes more professionalized, the experts impose their view on things a little bit. And it takes a few decades for archaeology to emerge as it is today, as a collaborative discipline that listens to the local stories, that takes into account the oral traditions, the mythology, everything, as well as the scientific findings.
But that has also changed, because back then in the 60s, when Marinatos did the big excavation in Santorini and found the Acrotiri that was covered by the lava, he would not refer to this guy that took him there. If that would have happened now, his name would be together with the archaeologist's name.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So they credit the local
and they should.
Guide, as it were.
The local person that noticed something is as important as the archaeologist that excavated it. So there's a lot of these kind of stories that are now surfacing, because that creates a kind of not ownership, but you're part of the story.
Yeah.
You know, and then your family would be interested, like in the family of my husband from Mykonos. They were about to make a well, and they would dig down, and they found this huge vase, which is about 1 meter and 30 centimeters high, which is the first and most exclusive narrative in clay about the Trojan War.
Wow.
About how the soldiers entered. You have on the base of the neck, you have the wooden horse with the faces of the soldiers. And then you have all the slaughtering. And it's like comics. It tells you the whole story of...
Panels.
Panels telling you how horrible war is. So this vase that was found there was probably standing in a cemetery with the bones of the dead inside.
Wow.
And was telling the world how horrible war is.
At this point, considering that we are going from Persephone to Cassandra in a couple of weeks' time, I think it's the perfect point at which to leave it. So thank you. Thank you for everything, really, for giving me this bug, first of all, because it seems to have transmitted within the family. It's the surprising thing doing this podcast has been how much stuff I don't know, how much stuff I'm finding out about all these stories. And that really is a gift.
It is. And for me, too,
yeah.
It's a gift because it has taken me back to my 10 years adventure through mythology.
Thank you, Alexandra. So that's my beloved Sis. Like all the best in her discipline, curious about every culture, enthusiastic about every tiny fragment, both academic and construction worker, geek, but also storyteller. To paraphrase archaeologist Mike Pitts, every street, every field, every moor or coastline has a human story, often untold by written history. Archaeology gives us the eyes to see the whole saga. Remember to follow this podcast, rate and review it. Spread the word. Let's grow the crew of this expedition. And if you can help fund the quest by visiting ko-fi.com/Podyssey. The next episode is not just about a fable, but the ultimate teller of fables, pithy teacher or insufferable moralist. Let's talk about Aesop. Podyssey is an audio production by Cooler Heads, written and presented by Alex Andreou. A playlist of all the music in the episode, as well as links to the films and works of art mentioned, can be found in the show notes. Creative input, sage advice and expert contributions by the 4 best muses a man could ask for: Alexandra Angeletaki-Røe, Debbie Chalice, Linda Marrick and Dr. Ruth Smith. Executive producers Naomi Smith and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canello. Alex Andreou's Podyssey is a collaboration with Sandstone Global.